Seizing central space immediately, this pawn opens diagonals for its queen and bishop, a common and ambitious beginning. Embracing the Sicilian's asymmetry immediately contests central influence and creates dynamic imbalances. Challenging the Sicilian's flank control, developing a piece towards the center while preparing for further central pawn advances. Preparing to challenge the center and open diagonals for the bishop. Unlocking the center, white opens lines and challenges black's pawn structure for immediate action. Opening the center allows for immediate piece activity, but invites a battle for central squares. Clearing the d-file, white aggressively pursues central control and opens avenues for future piece development. Challenging white's central dominance, this knight's development prepares for rapid castling and reinforces black's pawn structure. Asserting central dominion, this knight prepares for rapid development and pressure. Solidifying the center and preparing for bishop development, this move anchors black's pawn structure for the coming struggle. Safeguarding the king's immediate future and preparing for a healthy pawn structure is the primary aim here. Developing knights to their natural outposts solidifies black's central influence and prepares for further piece coordination. Securing the kingside flank with this bishop solidifies white's setup, anticipating pawn advances. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies the kingside pawn structure and prepares for castling, a crucial step for king's safety in this open Sicilian. Securing the king's safety through castling is a fundamental priority here, preparing for future central play. Securing the monarch is paramount, bringing the king to safety behind a newly formed pawn shield. Aggressively seizing central space, this move prepares to launch a kingside assault, potentially opening lines for attack. This move prepares to contest the c-file and potentially support a pawn push on the queen side, while also keeping the king safe. This knight repositions itself to avoid the pin and I-squares on the queen side. The rook strategically anchors the d-file, preparing for potential breakthroughs and bolstering central pawn control. Shifting the queen to e1 aims to solidify the kingside and prepare for a central pawn push, potentially opening lines for the rooks. Initiating queenside expansion with a pawn, this move subtly prepares to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's rooks. Positioning the queen here aims to reinforce the kingside pawn storm and prepare for a potential rook lift along the f-file, creating dynamic attacking prospects. Resigning the crucial c-file, the queen retreats to a passive square, allowing white significant central influence. Developing the bishop to f3 aims to control the d5 square and potentially prepare a kingside attack. Developing the bishop to d7 offers solid defense and prepares to challenge white's control of the d-file. Asserting control over the queenside, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's development and potentially exploit weaknesses. Seeking to destabilize white's queenside and create active pawn play, black boldly advances the b-pawn, aiming to gain queenside space and potentially launch an attack. The knight invades a vulnerable square, disrupting black's queenside pawn structure and potentially creating attacking opportunities. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure is key, but it may isolate the b5 pawn and hinder the development of the queen's bishop. Sacrificing the knight for a rook and a pawn opens the path for active piece play, aiming to overwhelm black's somewhat cramped position. Recovering the piece, black aims to activate the queen and challenge the exposed white king. Establishing control over the central d-file solidifies white's intention to pressure black's position. Liberating the queen's pawn opens lines, yet weakens dark squares around black's king. Re-establishing the rook on its home file signifies white's intent to consolidate and prepare for potential central advances, or even a kingside assault. Establishing pressure on the c-file with this rook offers a dynamic counterplay against white's center, potentially creating weaknesses. Solidifying central control while preparing for pawn breaks on the queenside showcases a patient positional strategy. Black aims to activate the queenside pawns and gain space, potentially eyeing the c3 knight. Solidifying the queenside structure prevents black from exploiting the open a file for counterplay. Opening a dynamic wing assault, black aims to disrupt white's queenside pawns and create immediate complications. Exploiting the open file, this capture immediately pressures black's queenside structure, aiming to unravel their defenses. Exploiting the open file, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially open lines for the rooks. Harnessing the open file, this rook's repositioning aims to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially control critical squares. A tactical regrouping effort aiming to escape the knight's pin and potentially find new counterplay on the queenside. Expanding white's central control, this move aims to create long-term space advantages and restrict black's mobility. Releasing the pawn tension now allows white to dominate the d-file and poses immediate threats. Recapturing the pawn opens the bishop, potentially pinning the queen or creating tactical shots. A knight repositions to the king's flank, potentially igniting an attack or reinforcing a defensive structure. Clearing the path to unleash the knight's full attacking potential, creating tactical opportunities. Reclaiming central space with the pawn solidifies your pawn structure, initiating a positional battle for control of the open d-file. Unleashing a potent queen fork, this sortie immediately targets black's unprotected rook and bishop, forcing a desperate defensive reaction. Accepting the queen trade simplifies the position, transitioning to an endgame where black's central pawn majority will become a crucial asset. Securing the open file solidifies central control, preparing for a decisive queenside advance or a swift attack on the king. A logical retreat to reorganize pieces and defend the vulnerable d6 pawn, eyeing potential central play. Targeting the open c-file now solidifies control and pressures black's position. Repositioning the bishop to this square aims to redeploy it defensively or potentially support a later pawn advance, subtly influencing the central control. Liberating the rook to contest the open file after the pawn exchange creates significant pressure on black's weakened queenside. The bishop retreats to bolster kingside defense and prepare for future pawn advances. Securing the rook's outpost on the queenside aims to restrict black's activity and prepare a queenside pawn push. This piece reestablishment aims to improve the bishop's influence and potentially support a pawn advance on the kingside. Unleashing a tactical storm, white seizes control of the open rook file, aiming to exploit black's exposed king. Rerouting the knight to g6 offers a dynamic way to challenge white's bishop and potentially open up lines for counterplay. Pressuring the b-pawn opens lines and potentially isolates the rook. Reclaiming central influence with the knight's journey to b6 offers a subtle yet crucial shift in positional dynamics. Opening the kingside diagonal offers fresh attacking possibilities against the isolated pawns. Consolidating pawns to secure the knight's escape route and prepare for future kingside action. Activating the king's defensive potential becomes paramount now, seeking a safer haven from potential pawn storms. Creating space on the kingside hints at future attacking possibilities or defensive maneuvering. The rook ventures to a more active file, seeking potential pawn pressure or escape squares. The knight's repositioning aims to infiltrate the queenside and create threats against the white king's pawn structure. Securing the kingside, this advance prepares for potential pawn pushes or a safer king relocation. Reorienting the knight to a more active central square, eyeing squares like d3 and aiming to disrupt white's space. The rook's repositioning seeks to exploit potential weaknesses on the queenside, while eyeing the d7 knight's safety. Reactivating the knight to a central outpost promises more dynamic play and potential for initiative. The rook's relocation to the queenside aims to restrict black's knight and pressure the file should it become open. Connecting the rooks and preparing to pressure white's advanced knight on b6 is a sound idea. Targeting the isolated knight on b6 with a centralizing rook sets up potential pressure and tactical opportunities. Unlocking the rook's potential along the open file offers a dynamic escape for the king and a potential disruption. Reactivating the rook on the d-file aims to generate pressure and potentially exploit any weaknesses on that open path. King safety is paramount as the rook lifts to a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing pawn weaknesses. Unlocking the rook's potential on the d-file now pressures black's isolated pawns, aiming to exploit their weakness. Repositioning the knight to patrol the king side and potentially target squares like g4 or f3. Reclaiming central influence, the knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing potential outpost development. Unleashing the rook to the second rank, black boldly seeks active counterplay against white's exposed king. Capturing the pawn opens a dangerous line towards the black king. Liberating the bishop allows for greater piece activity and potential counterplay against white's rook. Unleashing the c-pawn creates dynamic pawn tension and aims to dislodge the rook. Pushing the knight to d7 offers centralizing pressure, aiming to exploit white's slightly overextended pawn structure. The rook finds an active post, threatening to split the black pawn structure. Reclaiming material on the queen side, black aims to untangle and activate their pieces. Probing the open c-file to disrupt black's pawn structure. A desperate attempt to disrupt white's attacking structure. Watch for the knight's potential to become a target or a swashbuckling defender. Opening the c-file creates attacking possibilities against the pinned knight. Liberating the bishop from its pawn guard opens up dangerous diagonal pressure against white's weakened kingside. Opening up the knight to contest the important d-file, a crucial decision in this tense endgame. The bishop reroutes, seeking to bolster the knight and disrupt white's queenside control. Opening the e-file now unlocks lines of attack towards black's vulnerable king. Unleashing a fork attempt, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially gain material. Seizing the open files offers a dynamic path to attack the enemy king's weakened defenses. A bold thrust, this knight's check immediately disrupts white's consolidating pawns and forces a response. Activating the king into the game is paramount now, aiming to leverage its centralizing potential in this complex endgame. The knight's hop to g5 looks for tactical shots, but leaves its own king more exposed to future checks. Reinforcing the rook's grip on the 7th rank, threatening the pawn and creating a formidable barrier. Seeking shelter for the king, the bishop redeploys to a more defensive square. Targeting the pinned bishop with the rook forces a decision, potentially opening lines for the king's safety. Snatching the pawn opens a daring attack against the castled king, creating immediate threats. The king awkwardly ventures towards the center, potentially exposing itself to future threats from black's coordinated pieces. Hoping to trade down towards a drawn endgame, black exchanges pieces on the 7th rank. White's rook exchange simplifies into a winning pawn endgame, securing victory through material advantage. The knight's journey across the board aims to disrupt white's coordination and exploit the newly opened lines. Securing the queenside pawn majority with this advance is paramount for a winning endgame push.